Frank leaned back on his creaky porch chair, the kind that protested under his weight with every shift. He clutched a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, watching the pigeons in his yard squabble over crumbs. This was his life now, quiet, uneventful, and exactly how he liked it. At least, that's what he told himself whenever the silence got too loud. "I swear, Harold," Frank muttered to his favorite pigeon, "you get any fatter, and you'll need your own feeder." Harold cooed in defiance, waddling off like he understood the insult. Frank chuckled, sipping his coffee. Just another evening in paradise. Then came the crash. It was loud enough to rattle the windows, shaking Frank out of his chair and spilling coffee down his plaid shirt. "What in tarnation?" he barked, grabbing his trusty flashlight, a relic from a time when things were built to last, and marched toward the noise. In his backyard, something smoldered in the vegetable patch where his prized tomatoes once thrived. The sight stopped him cold. Amid the ruined plants and scorched earth was a sleek, silver spaceship that looked like it belonged in one of those sci-fi flicks his grandson loved. "Great," Frank grumbled. "Aliens land, and the first thing they do is destroy my tomatoes." "Figures." The ship hissed, and a panel slid open. A figure emerged, a woman, but not like any woman Frank had seen before. Her skin shimmered like polished metal, her eyes glowed faintly, and her limbs had an unsettling grace, like she was made of liquid silver. She stumbled forward, clutching some kind of glowing device, and said something in a language that sounded like a mix of whale song and static. Frank stared, unsure whether to laugh, run, or grab his shotgun. "Lady," he said, "if you're here to sell encyclopedias, I'm not interested." The alien woman tilted her head, clearly not understanding. She pointed at the ship and then at Frank, speaking again in her strange tongue. "Oh, great," Frank muttered, scratching his head. "Universal translators on the fritz. Story of my life." She dropped to her knees, bowing in what looked like desperation. Frank took a step back, unnerved. "Whoa there, no need for dramatics. You break it, you fix it. Ain't that the galactic rule or something?" The woman groaned, smacking the glowing device a few times. It crackled, then shifted to a mechanical, overly polite voice. "Please. Help me. Ship broken. Galactic authorities pursuit." Frank blinked. "Well, that's not ominous at all." The alien woman repeated. "Please. Help," looking at him with those glowing eyes that managed to convey desperation despite their inhumanity. Frank sighed, setting his flashlight down. "Fine, fine. But don't think this means I trust you. Last thing I need is some intergalactic fugitive bringing trouble to my yard. Got enough of that from raccoons." She didn't seem to understand the raccoon reference but nodded vigorously. "First things first," Frank said, motioning for her to follow him to the shed. "If you're gonna ask for help, you're gonna do it the human way, over pie." The alien woman hesitated but followed. Inside, Frank pulled out a half-eaten peach pie, setting it on the table. "You eat, I think. Deal?" She sniffed it cautiously before taking a small bite. Her reaction was immediate, eyes wide, glowing brighter, and a sound somewhere between a gasp and a purr escaped her lips. "Yeah, that's what I thought," Frank said smugly. "Best damn pie in the county. Maybe the galaxy, judging by your reaction." She tried to speak, but the translator fumbled, spitting out nonsense. Frank waved it off. "You don't gotta talk. Just eat. We'll figure out your spaceship problem after dessert. Priorities, you know?" For the first time, her posture relaxed. Frank didn't know what he'd just gotten himself into, but at least she had good taste in pie. Frank pushed open the door to his shed, which was more of a glorified junk heap than a proper workspace. The alien woman followed, ducking slightly under the low frame. Her glowing eyes scanned the cluttered room with a mix of curiosity and barely concealed horror. "Don't judge me," Frank grunted, rifling through a pile of tools. "You crash your fancy spaceship, you get Earth repairs. That's the deal." She tilted her head, watching as Frank triumphantly held up a roll of duct tape and a can of WD-40 like they were ancient artifacts. Behold, he said with mock reverence. The pinnacle of human engineering. Her translator crackled. These are tools? Damn right, they're tools. Fixed everything from tractors to broken hearts with ease. He wasn't entirely sure if she caught the joke, but she nodded solemnly, as if he just handed her sacred relics. Frank set the tools down and gestured to her. All right, show me what we're working with. She led him to the ship, crouching beside an exposed panel and pointing to a mess of glowing wires and what looked suspiciously like a melted toaster. Primary fusion core, overloaded. Needs repair. Frank squatted next to her, squinting at the alien tech. Lady, I don't know what a fusion core is, but that looks like the time my neighbor tried to deep fry a turkey and blew out his entire kitchen. Her translator sputtered for a moment before producing a single word. Dangerous. Yeah, no kidding. He reached into the panel, earning a sharp gasp from her. Relax. Worst that happens, I get fried. Ain't the first time I've messed with something I didn't fully understand. To her visible shock, Frank started tinkering, twisting a few wires here and there and spraying WD-40 liberally. It wasn't elegant, but the faint hum of the ship powering back up suggested he was on the right track. See? Human ingenuity, he said with a smirk. Sometimes brute force and a little elbow grease beats all that fancy alien nonsense. She stared at him, her translator finally catching up. You repaired it? Not yet, but we're getting there. Give me a minute. And pass me that wrench. No, not that one, the one that looks like a medieval weapon. As they worked, Frank found himself amused by her awkward attempts to help. She struggled to grip the wrench, nearly dropping it on his foot. When he asked for a screwdriver, she handed him a fork from what appeared to be an alien dining set. Close enough, he muttered, shaking his head. They fell into a rhythm, though, with Frank barking instructions and her fumbling through his collection of mismatched tools. Every so often, she'd mutter something under her breath in her native language, probably alien curses, judging by the tone, and he couldn't help but laugh. You're not half bad, he admitted as they secured the final panel. For someone who's probably never seen a wrench before. She straightened, brushing soot off her shimmering skin. Your method's unconventional. But effective. Yeah, well, that's the Earth way. Do what works and figure out the details later. He leaned back against the ship, wiping sweat from his brow. Speaking of Earth, you should probably try some more pie. Can't have you leaving without a proper introduction to human cuisine. Her translator crackled again. Pie is energy source? Frank burst out laughing. Sure, let's go with that. It's the secret to all our accomplishments. Powered by peaches and sugar. Her glowing eyes narrowed in a way that suggested she wasn't entirely sure if he was joking. Humans, fascinating. Yeah, we're a real piece of work. He stood, stretching his back with a groan. All right, let's take a break before we test your fancy fusion core. I'm too old to keep bending over like that. As they headed back to the house, she spoke hesitantly. You live alone? Yep. Just me, my pigeons, and this charming shed of wonders. He smirked. Why? Thinking about moving in? Her translator glitched, producing a garbled mix of static and words that sounded suspiciously like companionship and unlikely. Don't worry, he said, waving her off. I'm not exactly a catch. You're safe here, though. Even if the galactic cops show up, I'll give them a good talking to. Her gaze softened, and for a moment, the humor gave way to something deeper. You kind? Frank scratched the back of his neck, suddenly feeling awkward. Yeah, well, don't get used to it. I'm just doing this so you don't blow up my yard again. But as they reached the porch, he couldn't help but glance at her, wondering if maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the worst thing to ever crash into his life. The faint hum of the repaired ship gave Frank a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in years. He leaned back in his porch chair, sipping a fresh cup of coffee, while Lyra paced nervously in the yard, her eyes scanning the sky. They're coming, she said abruptly, her translator making her voice sound far more robotic than the panic it carried. Frank squinted at her. Who's they, exactly? And should I be worried? Galactic Enforcement, she replied, her tone sharp. They will not listen. They will not negotiate. They only punish. Frank snorted, setting his coffee down. Sounds like the HFY back when I lived in town. You'd get fined for having the wrong shade of lawn chairs. Lyra didn't laugh, her glowing eyes fixed on the horizon. The tension in her stance told him this wasn't just a drill. Frank sighed and stood, grabbing his trusty flashlight and duct tape. Well, if they're coming here, they'd better be ready for a fight, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. I've dealt with trespassers before. Once scared off a raccoon the size of a Labrador with nothing but a broom. Lyra gave him a puzzled look but didn't have time to ask questions. A loud whirring sound filled the air, followed by the descent of a gleaming, spherical craft. It hovered above the yard, its underside opening to reveal a ramp. 3 figures descended, each clad in shimmering uniforms that screamed bureaucracy with a side of menace. Frank muttered under his breath. Great! Space IRS. One of the officers, tall and stiff as a flagpole, stepped forward. His voice was deep and monotone, amplified by some kind of vocal device. You are harboring a fugitive. Relinquish her, and no harm will come to you. Frank crossed his arms, his stance defiant. Listen, buddy, I don't know who you think you're talking to, but this is private property. If you want to haul someone off, you're gonna have to go through me. The officer tilted his head, clearly unprepared for such blatant defiance. Lyra tugged on Frank's sleeve, whispering urgently. You don't understand. They will not leave without me. Frank glanced at her, then back at the officer. Well, too bad. She's my guest, and where I come from, we don't throw our guests to the wolves, or the space cops, in this case. The officer's glowing eyes narrowed. You leave us no choice. The other 2 officers raised what looked like glowing batons, stepping toward Frank. Without missing a beat, he grabbed his flashlight and clicked it on, shining the beam directly in their faces. Back off, glow sticks, he barked. This thing's powered by D batteries. You don't want to mess with it. To his surprise, the officers recoiled, momentarily blinded by the light. Lyra's jaw dropped as she watched the scene unfold. What are you doing? Improvising, Frank muttered, waving the flashlight like a sword. You got any better ideas? Lyra hesitated, then stepped forward, her translator struggling to keep up. He is a powerful Earth warrior. His weapon unmatched. Frank shot her a look, but she kept going, her voice steady despite the absurdity of her claim. You cannot defeat him. Earth will retaliate. The officers exchanged glances, their rigid demeanor faltering. Earth has warriors? One of them muttered, clearly uncertain. Oh, we've got warriors, Frank said, stepping into the role with surprising ease. And you're looking at one of the best. Decorated in, the Great Pi Wars of '98. Lyra shot him a bewildered look, but he waved her off, continuing his bluff. You really want to risk Earth's wrath over a parking ticket or whatever nonsense you're chasing her for? The lead officer hesitated, clearly torn. We are authorized to use force if necessary. Frank smirked, holding up his duct tape. Go ahead. Try me. I've got more where this came from. The officers stared at the shiny roll of tape, clearly unsure of its purpose but wary nonetheless. The tension hung in the air for what felt like an eternity before the lead officer finally relented. Very well, he said, his voice clipped. But this is not over. The officers retreated back to their craft, which ascended with a faint hum before disappearing into the sky. Frank exhaled, the adrenaline finally wearing off. Well, that was something. Lyra turned to him, her expression a mix of amazement and disbelief. You saved me. Yeah, well, don't get used to it, he said, brushing imaginary dust off his hands. I'm not in the habit of playing hero. But someone's gotta teach those bureaucrats a thing or two about manners. She stepped closer, her glowing eyes softening. I owe you everything. Frank waved her off, trying to hide the slight blush creeping up his neck. Don't mention it. Seriously. Don't. I've got a reputation to maintain. But as he watched her smile, a real, genuine smile that lit up her face in a way he hadn't seen before, he couldn't help but feel like maybe, just maybe, this whole alien fiasco wasn't such a bad thing after all. Frank leaned against the side of Lyra's ship, wiping his hands on his already grease-stained pants. Well, I think we've done it, he said, motioning to the faint hum emanating from the ship's core. Should hold together long enough to get you wherever it is you're going. Lyra ran her glowing hands over the panel, her face etched with relief as the systems blinked to life. You have no idea how much this means to me, she said, her translator smoothing out her words into a tone that sounded almost human. Frank waved her off, trying to play it cool. Don't mention it. Just another day in the life of Frank Thompson, farmer, engineer, galactic fugitive harborer. Her eyes fixed on him, soft and thoughtful. You are different. Humans different. I did not expect this. He chuckled, the sound a little rough. Yeah, well, we're full of surprises. You're not so bad yourself, for someone who crash-landed and turned my tomatoes into charcoal. She hesitated, stepping closer. It's more than that. You didn't have to help me. You risked much? Frank shrugged, though he could feel the weight of her gaze. What can I say? I've got a soft spot for folks in trouble. Even if they're glowing aliens with bad luck and worse parking skills. Lyra's lips twitched, a faint smile that seemed foreign but genuine. You hide your heart with humor, she said, her voice quieter now. He glanced away, suddenly finding the ship's hull fascinating. Yeah, well, life's easier that way. Don't need anyone poking around in my soft spots. They're called soft for a reason. Her smile grew, and for a moment they stood there in comfortable silence. The hum of the ship, the chirping of crickets in the distance, the faint scent of pie still lingering in the air, it all felt oddly right. Finally, Lyra broke the quiet. I must go. But I want to repay you. Frank raised an eyebrow. Repay me? Lady, you're already costing me a fortune in duct tape and emotional energy. What more could you owe me? She ignored his deflection, pulling a small, glowing device from her belt. This is a communicator. It will allow us to stay in contact. If you ever need help, I will come. He took the device hesitantly, turning it over in his hands. What, like an intergalactic phone? Can I call you if I run out of coffee? Lyra laughed, the sound musical and entirely unexpected. For emergencies, Frank? He nodded, tucking the communicator into his shirt pocket. All right, fine. But don't expect me to be calling you every week. I'm not great at long-distance relationships. Her smile faltered, replaced by something more somber. You joke, but I will miss this. Miss you. Frank felt a lump form in his throat, which he promptly ignored. Yeah, well, don't get all sentimental on me. You've got a galaxy to get back to, and I've got pigeons to feed. She stepped closer, her glowing eyes locked onto his. Frank. He froze. There was something in the way she said his name, soft, almost reverent, that made his chest tighten. For the first time in a long time, he didn't have a snarky comeback ready. Lyra tilted her head, studying him as though memorizing his face. You are, more than you think you are. Yeah, well, he said, finally finding his voice. Don't go spreading that around. Got a reputation to keep as a grumpy old man. She smiled, her expression warm and tinged with sadness, then turned to climb into the ship. Frank watched as the hatch closed, the hum growing louder as the engines powered up. He raised a hand in a half-hearted wave, unsure if she could even see him. Safe travels, Lyra. Don't forget to practice your parallel parking. The ship began to lift off, the glow from its engines lighting up the yard. Frank felt a strange mix of pride and loss as he watched it rise higher into the sky. But just as it reached the treetops, the ship sputtered, coughed, and promptly descended back into the yard with a loud thud. Frank stared, blinking in disbelief. You've got to be kidding me. The hatch opened again, and Lyra stepped out, looking sheepish. It seems the repairs were incomplete. Frank rubbed his temples, muttering under his breath. Of course they were. Why wouldn't they be? It's not like I was planning on sleeping tonight or anything. Lyra hesitated at the base of the ramp. May I stay a little longer? Frank sighed, his gruff demeanor barely masking the small smile tugging at his lips. Fine. But only if you promise not to touch my tools again. She nodded solemnly, her expression serious despite the situation. I will learn. From you. He chuckled, shaking his head. Lady, you've got a lot to learn about humans. But I guess I've got nothing better to do. As she followed him back toward the house, Frank glanced at the communicator in his pocket and then at Lyra. For the first time in years, he felt something stir, a spark of purpose, maybe even hope. Well, he muttered, looks like I'm stuck with you for a while. Lyra smiled, and for once, Frank didn't mind the idea of a little chaos in his life.